Muy buenos días.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, from this main location for the United Nations in Santiago de Chile. I am the head of the event, the launch of the joint report towards sustainable food and nutrition security in Latin America and the Caribbean in response to the global food crisis. This is a hybrid meeting, in person and online. This is being held at our main offices in person and by Zoom, and you can follow it at cepal.cepal and from the FAO, as in addition to the social media. We greet everyone who is with us at this transmission, and mainly the journalists and representatives of the mass media who are accompanying us on this occasion and have also registered to follow this broadcast online. The report will be presented by José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, who is the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, and followed by the Regional Representative of FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean, Lubetkin, and online by the Regional Director of the World Food Program, Lola, Castro. So after the interventions by these representatives of the three organizations, we will open up for the exchange of Q&A with the media. And so, the Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I would like to greet, first of all, my dear Mario Lubetkin, Director of the Regional Office of FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean, my dear Lola Castro, who is connected online and the Regional Director for the World Food Program, and professionals of the press in person and online. Dear colleagues, friends, it is with very great pleasure that we this morning will be presenting the special report towards sustainable food and nutrition security in Latin America and the Caribbean in response to the global food crisis. This is the result of an interagency collaboration between ECLAC, the Regional Office of the FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the World Food Program. And I would like to thank everyone who took part in the drafting of this report, coordinated by Janet Sanchez of ECLAC, Maya Takagi from FAO, and Ellen Kramer from the World Food Program. Each organization has had an ample team of professionals supporting this, and although it would take too long to mention all of them, I would like to extend to each my sincere thanks, and several are in the room. The relevance of the topic and has brought together unconditional support to understand the main trends of the food and fertilizers and how to support the countries of the region in their responses. We're hoping that the inputs of this special report will be useful to all countries for their policies in response to the crisis. And so I would like to proceed with the presentation that has been prepared with a summary of the results and recommendations. Shall we proceed? First, yes, go ahead. Very well. And so here we have a list of the main messages, in fact, that correspond to the main sections of the document, and that we will be reviewing one by one. The first is that there is an international crisis context, and one of the dimensions has been to compromise regional access to food and agricultural inputs. So we're going to see this in detail. And second, the restrictions on food production and trade exacerbate the impact of climate change. And what are the influence of this, the climate change, and what we're seeing now? And also Latin America and the Caribbean is highly dependent on the importation of fertilizers. And as the prices have risen, they're each day less affordable for producers. Another conclusion is that in inflation, the fight against inflation must consider food inflation. Food inflation increases the risk of hunger as it hits lower income households hardest. And the fight against inflation must consider other instruments beyond monetary policy in order not to compromise economic recovery, which is another point that we wanted to make. And then lastly, the policies need to respond to the emergency while promoting changes in pattern to exposure to the crisis. And so, if we take a look at the international context, one of the things is that the food price index fell by 23.3%, 14.9%, 23.3 points, that is almost 15% from March to October 2022. But several upward pressure factors persist. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, signed in Istanbul on 27 July under the auspices of the UN, as you know, helped to bring down grain prices. And the agreement was renewed. And on November the 17th, for another 120 days, energy prices remain high, although they've already shown a slight trend to change, but continue to be still much higher than they were prior to the pandemic. And this is affecting gas and transport and all of the energy crisis. High gas prices and plant closures and reduced production in Europe have kept fertilizer prices high. And hot and dry weather reduced the yields of crops such as wheat and maize in the 2022-23 season that we're going through now. And this will lead to a global maize production which is expected to be reduced by 4% and rice by about 2%. Now, this is the graph that I was talking about, which is essential. Here you can see that in the current cycle of food prices rises in the steepest on record. Plant oil, cereals, as you can see, quite a sharp growth. The food price index of the FAO, measured in real terms, reached its historical peak of 156.3 points in March 22, and in October the index dropped for the 7th consecutive month, but still continues at historical highs with 132.9. And the current inflationary cycle is more persistent than in 2008 and 11. And 3 of the 4 episodes of seen of this occurred in the last 15 years. And the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine have, of course, affected the supply and has led to disruptions to the value chains. The Ukrainian war is affecting and will continue to affect beyond this year, 23 as well. And the Ukrainian agriculture is being hit hard. A drop of about 1/3 of the sown area is estimated for this time. And Ukraine and Russia are one of the main exporters of agricultural goods. And Russia, under the trade embargo, may lack some supplies of machinery, seeds, and pesticides that it usually buys from the European Union, and this is a significant disruption. And in the rest of the world, the high fertilizer prices threaten to reduce yields in some producing areas and affect production for domestic markets. And we're going to see the issue of fertilizers in greater depth, because this could have consequences not only immediately but forward. And then reductions in cereal harvest also have an impact on livestock farming with increases in cost and consumer prices. And added to this, there are various climate-related supply shocks that affect harvests. And here you can see a graph with the balance in cereal trade. Latin America, 4% of the region and 14% of employment. But you can see here the variety of countries in the extreme right, those who are surplus countries, quite a few major exporters, but the great majority of the countries in the region are in deficit. If you see this in average for the region is a net exporter. In 21, we exported $150 billion in agri-food and imported about 100 million. But as you can see here, for cereals at least, in most countries, they really are in deficit. As I said, South America is surplus, but the Central America and the Caribbean are in deficit. And this has allowed agriculture to be one of the few sectors of positive growth during the pandemic and increasing exports. But it is clear that this is a very heterogeneous sector with high differences between the levels of productivity between small and large producers. And that is also important to understand. And above all, policies, of course, in response must consider the heterogeneity. War and climate factors have affected production more than the pandemic. The Russian Federation and Ukraine are among the most important suppliers of the world. Together supplied in 2021 12% of the traded calories and 30% of wheat exports, 20% of corn or maize, and 5% of sunflower oil in the world market. And the US, China, India, and the EU, the four major global cereal producers, have faced droughts, heat waves that have reduced the yields and grain production. And although a slight rise in world wheat production is expected for 2023 due to a higher production in other areas, and they will offset the fall of Argentina and the EU, world drops in maize and rice are expected. This has affected the production of maize, basically on account of Ukraine, and drought in many areas, such as India, the USA, and China, will not be offset by a sufficient rise in other countries or areas. And also, the rice is particularly important for world food safety, and this is a less commercial crop as the others, with many small-scale farmers and that face rises in the price of inputs. And so the world rice production is expected to drop by 2%. The other important issue here is export restrictions. And right since the start of the war, 29 countries imposed 63 restrictive measures on food export, and that affected 17% of the traded calories worldwide. 5% of the region's imported calories are currently affected by trade restrictions imposed in response to the war in Ukraine. And this affects 36% of nitrogen fertilizers, 20% of potash fertilizers, and 19% of phosphate fertilizers imported by the region and are currently affected by trade restrictions. And so this of the restrictions is also a very important element in terms of the impact, behavior, and the sort of recommendations for the future. And there is also an issue of fiscal restrictions that affect available revenue to finance food imports. So we're at a time of a very significant fiscal tightening almost all countries, some more, some less, there's a high cost of debt servicing, and world credit conditions have become more restrictive. And this, of course, has to do with the recommendations that we're going to see now at the end, and that have to do with the support for production, cash transfers, and social protection mechanisms, because this is going to require fiscal effort. So we wanted to point out that. So here, the fertilizers, as we have said, are becoming less and less affordable for farmers. And also with the fact that the region depends a lot on fertilizer imports. Here you can see energy prices and of several types of fertilizer, everything related to the inputs, nitrogen, fertilizers, potash, phosphate, as well as the farming raw materials, the phosphates. All these things had already risen significantly in 2021 on account of the high prices of natural gas, which is the main input for their production. And in the first weeks of the war, from March to April 22, the price of fertilizers reached their peak for several years. The Russian Federation, in 2021, was the great world exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, and the second for potash, and the third of phosphate fertilizers. So you can see the very direct connection with the war and what is happening there. The region imports close to 80% of the fertilizers used in farming. 80% of the fertilizers are imported. And that is why, of course, that this rise that you can see here in the prices has a very significant impact. It is likely that the price of fertilizers will remain high in view of the uncertainties in terms of the supply and the behavior, although we can see some small reductions there, but they continue to be much higher than in previous years. And with the price at twice what they were last year, it is clear that the impact on the sector is considerable. And in many cases, these rises are even greater in the prices of fertilizers than in the prices of the farm products. And so the thing is, how is this going to affect farmers, and what is their reaction going to be? And so there, we need to take into account that there is a major heterogeneity. You have a commercial farming that does have the ability to continue, in general, buying fertilizers, even though they are more expensive. But we also have farmers that are much smaller and they do not have the same capacity. And one of their reactions will be to reduce the application of fertilizers, and which will have greater consequences on the amounts produced because the yields will come down. And this is a serious issue that we are seeing here and affect the recommendations regarding the relevance of supporting them, because the great majority of the food production, you must think that a lot of the commercial exported production, where there are several countries that are grain powers, but what we eat in Latin America and the Caribbean, the great majority does not come from those companies, but small-scale farmers for the domestic markets. And well,
the region depends on the imports of fertilizers. As I've said, this graph on the left shows the strong dependency the region has on these imports. No other region has such high rate of imports and for consumption, 80%, I said. No region that has such an important agricultural sector. In a strategic sector, it's amazing that it depends so much as an imported input, and that depends on decisions and political trade decisions made by other countries. And this does have a great impact on what to do into the future. On the right, we see the indicator of accessibility of fertilizers, and here we see soy, maize, and rice. And this has been a downward trend, especially for rice. The production has to do more with internal consumption. The imported input in dollars have also suffered the effect of the depreciation of their currency. And for the others, the difference in the behavior of the prices to the producer has been more unfavorable for some of the producers. The risk is that an increase of that gap between producers that can pay for imported fertilizers and those who cannot afford to pay these high prices. Now, the other message and the conclusion so far, which is really very important, is that the increase of the prices in food increases the risk of food in lack of security. If we have an impact of inflation because of the food. The graph on the left in the region has a CPI on food and beverages that have gone on the downward trend, and there was a third month in a row of a downward trend, but that is the last piece for 22. But for the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean, the inflation in foodstuff, that is in brown, has accelerated even more than the general inflation from mid-2020 in July of 22. Considering the average of 10 countries in the region, inflation reaches 12.4% comparing to 8 of the general inflation. These are the two lines. And in October, the inflation on foods rose less than the general. The behavior of food inflation brings in the risk of having a healthy nutrition and even hunger because it affects even more the more vulnerable families. Here we see on the right, we have 17 countries, and for the poorest, it's 1.4 higher than the wealthier group. In the first quintile, the food contributes to 2/3 of the inflation, general inflation. So this inflation, that is a food inflation, really affects even more the poorer sectors. ECLAC estimates an increase in extreme poverty in 2022, especially in rural areas. As you can see, rural poverty is structurally higher than the urban one. The gap is very important for talking about extreme poverty, and its impact in rural areas is twice as hard as in cities, and this is related to hunger and food insecurity, whereas the urban one is expected to go down in 22 after the increase in more jobs, but both are going to go up according to our estimations. Extreme poverty would reach 81.282 million persons. Of these, 21.6 million live in rural areas. Much of the rural poverty has to do with independent farming, and this has to do with what's happening in most countries. Most of the family farming are responsible for 89% of the total agricultural exports, and these are now facing the region limitations for their development: low access to land, low capital availability, lending, and much of the food stuff that we consume comes from that. They produce about 80% of the food stuff that is consumed in the region. So the support policies, and this is one of the recommendations to family farming. And this is strategic in as much as it will reduce uncertainty on food and fight rural extreme poverty. FAO estimates that food insecurity increased in the region more than the world average. Food security and nutrition in the world, as a report from FAO, that monitors hunger and food security through three indicators that are here stated: underfeeding, and food insecurity from severe to moderate. Here we see a graph for the region and for the rest of the world. And we have observations for 19, 20, and 21. As we can see, at first, 1.86 of the people, 86 million in the people, are under the threshold of underfeeding. To be clear, these are 56 million persons who are hunger. That's what this means. This figure is even more harsh in the Caribbean, that is 16.6% of the population, 7 million. In Central America, we're talking about 15 million persons. In South America, 34 million persons who are facing hunger. Aside from that, in severe food insecurity has doubled. In Latin America, in Caribbean, it went from 7 to 14.2 in 21. We're talking about persons who have spent more than one day feeling hungry. This is the summary of the diagnosis. And I will quickly go through the recommendations of policies. Some come from that diagnosis. Immediately speaking, we want food security to become a strategic priority. We have to activate the social protection systems, cash transfers, for example, and we have to cover the risk population. We have to have food programs. Many are offered through school lunches to popular feeding sites, and they had a very important role during the pandemic. But right now is not the time to reduce that efforts. Quite the contrary, it's time to redouble efforts because we are feeling these diagnosis. We must continue investing in these food programs and relate the social protection programs with the encouragement of agricultural production, improving the local supply chains and boosting small farmers' production. And this is different from the export commercial production, whereby several Latin American countries are big powers. Oh, and what about the food that is produced and that is eaten by most countries? Now, another big thing has to do with fertilizers. There is a whole set of measures that are being adopted. And here we have information in the document showing the measures adopted for foodstuff and also for fertilizers, but all the support to small farming, as I said, with soft loans and bio inputs that may be available, strengthening technical assistance towards an agriculture that will depend less on synthetic fertilizers and going for more resilient ones, and also strengthening digital technical assistance with transparency to encourage a agroecological transitions, but technical assistance to the small farmers. Other actions that can be adopted and that are explained have to do with supporting the markets, not hindering international trade of foodstuff and fertilizers. Some measures have been adopted, but they still don't contribute. The freer and the less intervention to trade, especially the export of foodstuff, is more convenient. We must improve transparency, as we said, with price contention of the basic basket in the distribution chains. That can be helpful. The ministries should follow up on the behavior of the prices, avoiding speculation, for example, and looking at the behavior of the food component in the basic basket, diversifying suppliers and promoting local consumption and local supply. Now, at the regional level, there are things that can be coordinated, such as implementing responses for the region as a whole and trying to, and also looking at the existing as plans, such as the Plan for Food Security and Nutrition from CELAC 2025. And there are other midterm measures that will take more time, such as improving the supply of food, regional foodstuff, promoting urban agriculture, digitalization of agro input, promoting private investment, for more productivity, and another is the transition towards more sustainable agriculture with training, improving also the supply of fertilizers and other ecological practices because we import a lot of fertilizers, but promoting the regional production would help out and also increasing the efficiency of the fertilizers. This is pretty much what I wanted to bring you, but you have more details in the uh, report, and I'm available for any questions you may have. Thank you very much. We immediately give the floor to the regional director from FAO in Latin America and the Caribbean, Mario Lubetkin. You have the floor, sir. Thank you, Jose Manuel Salazar, my friend, Executive Secretary for ECLAC, Lola Castro, Regional Direction of PM for Latin America and the Caribbean, who is following us from Panama. We also greet you, officials from Latin American governments and from the Caribbean as well, who are watching us from virtual means, and our colleagues from ECLAC, from FAO, and from WEP. All of you who are participating from our region. I join Jose Manuel in thanking the team that has helped out in the preparation of this report, all of the staff involved and those who worked behind the scenes. I would like to thank you all and congratulate you for this excellent report. I have a few reflections to make on that. For us at FAO and for all, the food crisis is a strong concern. It shows the situation of hunger and poverty, but it really affects us because we know that Latin America and the Caribbean have a potential capability to produce foodstuff of more than a thousand three for more than 1.3 billion persons. That is twice the population that we have in the region, and it has 14% of the crops that are found in the globe. This is part of the report that we have just heard from Jose Manuel. The figures are interesting, but I'd like to mention or concentrate on a few that are more sensible for us. Jose Manuel talked about the 56.5 million persons who are hungry in Latin America and the Caribbean. And before COVID, the situation was one whereby 43 million persons were hungry. So there is a growth of 30% after COVID. These are big figures. Let us look at the recent report published by ECLAC that talks about poverty by the end of 22 of 201 million persons, individuals like us who are going hungry. This is a big figure, and this means a backing. It's going back in the last few years. We're talking about 10 or 12 years lag. We're really going backwards in terms of hunger. Latin America shows that most countries are facing problems in production, merchandising, and prices because of the Ukraine conflict. You have noticed the data in the report, so I won't repeat them, but there are some data that are really quite symbolic. 26 of the 33 countries are wheat imports, and 13 depend on maize production. And if the rise in prices because of the conflict is affecting the local economy, mainly family farming and the small scale producers, as we just heard. Now, analyzing the behavior of the food prices in the last few years, we were seeing that Recently, escalation started in 2020, mainly because of the price variation of vegetable oils and cereals, and CPIs that are published by ourselves on an annual basis said that 60 point between June and May reached the maximum historic level because of the global crisis. I think it's important to notice that the increase in international prices of agricultural prices have a direct impact in final consumers, affecting even more the low income countries and households because uh, these have uh, less to pay, diminishing the intake of a healthy nutrition that is very important when we talk about hunger and nutrition.
We will try to address this in the annual report launch called Outlook, and we will launch focus precisely on these themes and the fertilizers also that José Manuel was elaborating on because the process is essential. The report warns us on the levels of affordability for agricultural goods, especially with the war in Ukraine and the Russian production capacity and Ukrainian as well. The rise in price levels that reached a peak in April 2022 and that are forecast to continue rising, and this will without a doubt affect the farming and food production program around the world. Unfortunately, the region depends a lot on imported fertilizers. 85% of fertilizers that are imported to the region, and no other region of the world depends so much on these inputs as we in Latin America and the Caribbean. Additionally, and although not at the center of our attention, the climate crisis will be a major factor and affecting the farming production here in Latin America. And in this complex scenario, because one of the things that we could say is, well, we can do some beautiful forecasts, but we must think of how to support the governments and the various stakeholders with regard to the possible solutions, which is the point that José Manuel highlighted at the end of the report. And 10 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have already implemented measures to reduce the cost of importing food as well as tariff reductions. 9 countries implemented actions to promote the consumption of local produce through fairs and short trading circuits, as well as mechanisms to monitor prices and supply, and to face the price rise of fertilizers, which is a main issue in the report. 11 countries of the region implemented subsidies for inputs and cash transfers to farmers so as not to stop the food production, and 7 countries increased their support for production and use of fertilizers. And through this report, and here I would also like to highlight this, the CELAC plan for food security, with the CELAC plan, which was agreed in 2015, seeks to eradicate hunger and undernourishment by 2025. And I would like to point this out because this report must serve, and so we thank the media for the dissemination that they may make of this in terms of the policies that governments might adopt. In just a few days in Buenos Aires, together with the presidency of Argentina, of CELAC, together with the ministers of agriculture in Argentina and Latin America, will meet to elaborate further, not only on the diagnosis of the situation that we already know more or less that we're on the wrong road, but what are the possible paths to resolve it. And this is a personal opinion of mine. I think that COVID made us all turn inwards and not do what Latin America and the Caribbean used to do before, which was to circulate information and successful experiences. And the meeting we have with CELAC in Argentina is a search for successful experiences that other countries have achieved And in all of these organizations, ECLAC, FAO, and World Food Program, what we want is to provide technical training and sharing ideas so that governments may qualify the people. And Jose Manuel also mentioned a point that I wanted to underscore, and that is the fact that the small uh, farmers, small rural farmers. And yesterday, we began a conference on family agriculture that is going to end tomorrow. And this is attended by 10 ministers and many NGOs and educational, informative organizations, more than 200 participants, because that is the way to go. These are the first victims of the report and the need to help and convey and discuss with them, because we do not necessarily have all the solutions. We too are receivers of these things that are being done in Latin America based on the concrete experience of governments and the private sector and the civil society in order to find solutions to this very difficult situation. We would like to point out that none of us on our own may address the situation. And that is why I highlight the work that we're doing with ECLAC and that will be elaborated on during the next period with our friends from WFP and other agencies of the UN. We're working together because no one can do it on their own. And also we require the participation of the media so that they may create the necessary awareness among public opinion and also have a mechanism for reciprocal feedback. And it's a very exceptional stage that we're going through. This concept of the fund is in fact to reach a 2030 without poverty, without hunger. Difficult to achieve, as you know. The aim that was considered in 2015 and the underlying aim is to not leave anyone behind. Not at all easy. The report shows how complex all of this is, but we are hopeful that we can achieve it. Thank you, Mario Lubetkin, the representative of the FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the other component in the other partner has been the World Food Program. The regional director, Lola Castro, is with us online through Zoom. And of course, we will be giving her the floor. Yes, good morning and thank you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but greetings from Panama. And well, a lot has been said. Jose Manuel and Mario have exhaustively explained the report. I would merely like to emphasize some areas and bring it down to ground in terms of the persons affected in the region and what we are doing jointly so as to reduce this concern that exists not only at world level but also at regional level regarding the impact of these trickle-down crises in terms of the availability of food for to the most vulnerable and poor in the region. For us at the World Food Program, the work in the region and studies together with ECLAC and the FAO, it serves to highlight the relevance of this, of designing short, medium, and long-term measures to offset the impact of this multidimensional crisis and also the next to come that are being announced, and try to ensure that the food systems and above all the lower quintiles in our society may not suffer the hunger that we are seeing on the rise. And so, in order to not repeat what has already been said by my dear colleagues Jose Manuel and Mario, I would also like to mention another couple of areas. One, stabilizing the issue of the climate crisis. But today, we've talked about the chronic impact of drought, of flooding, climate change, and Niño, La Niña. But just to say that this year, the hurricane period that we've had in the Caribbean, we've had 1,300,000 people that have been affected, and their means of life have been affected, and 800,000 have been supported by governments and UN agencies, including the WFP and others. And so we can see how in a simple hurricane season, we have over 1 million people who are living in food insecurity. And the other thing is the rise, and I would like to underscore this, the increase in migration. This has tremendous implications for people who intend to migrate from their countries of origin, tremendous loss of human capital, but also the countries of destination. They suffer because they cannot service these people appropriately. And so the data that we have from September 21 and 2022 is that there was a rise of 37% in the arrival of migrants coming from this same hemisphere in the border between Mexico and the USA. And another example, which is very alarming, is of transit through Japan to Darien. The border between Colombia and Panama recorded a 73.5% increase in migrant crossings in the recent months. So together, the WIM and other organizations, including ECLAC and the WFP, says that the intention to migrate in Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the highest in the world. And 4 out of 10 households said that in 2021 that they didn't intend to migrate. And this is in comparison to an 8% in 2019. So it is imperative that we should invest more in the underlying causes, as we have said before, in order to turn around this trend. And one of the reasons is food uncertainty. Well, speaking of food and nutritional safety, we've seen that multidimensional poverty is each day more and more connected to a rise in food insecurity and the lack of access to healthy living. And we've heard the results of the survey that it was published in 2022 with data of 2021, but to give you data that we are right now working on in 11 countries where the World Food Program is working in the region, and we have data for this, we've seen an incredible rise in food safety from March through November 2022. In March 2022, we had 8.7 million people in those countries experiencing severe food uncertainty. And now in November, we have more. And so inflation, the rising in the cost of the basic basket means that people, the poorest, are unable to have a minimum healthy diet with a current income. This is a trend that, as our colleagues have said, we are not seeing that will improve in the short come. We are seeing things that we've not seen before in this region, such as in Haiti, 19,000 people living in a catastrophic situation, almost a brula. We're calling it a catastrophe. And this is on account of the multiple crises affecting this country, and of course, the political and social crisis that has exacerbated the situation, and also in our region. And ECLAC studies and WFP indicate that there is a very high cost and socioeconomic impact of the double burden of undernourishment. We are addressing the impact of undernourishment, balancing this with overweight and obesity. And this is represents a loss of 2% of annual GDP in countries such as Guatemala. And so in that sense, we must work far more and investing far more on the opportunities that we have in the region. One of these is social protection. And that quite clearly is essential in order to prevent, mitigate the impact of shocks that speed up this vicious circle that we're talking about: poverty, food insecurity, and nutrition. And we must work together, as the study says, to have a greater connection between the social protection systems and the food systems in order to have a more sustainable impact on food and nutritional safety of those who are most vulnerable and living in the region. It is clear that it is critical to invest in the strengthening of the more inclusive system. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw during the COVID-19 how there were 340 new social protection mechanisms that were extremely quick in preventing a sharp rise of poverty and food insecurity. We're working together with the UN agencies, ECLAC, and we're working with the governments in areas such as Haiti in a national policy to make operational and scale up social transfers, seeing more than 100,000 people, or in the Caribbean, Nicaragua, where investments have been made in in mechanisms for parametric insurance when you have climate shocks to really help societies immediately. In Colombia and the Caribbean, and where with governments they've increased data management systems and innovative means for the digitalization of payments, the financial inclusion of women. All of these mechanisms of social protection are working in the region in order to improve the situation. Also, we can highlight, as has been said, the use of school meals, which is a key point in order to have a sustainable and large-scale impact on the food safety of children. In our region, we have 85 million girls and boys that are seen with National School Food Program. And this is one of the highest figures out. And this is one of the greatest coalition of these summits, food summits. And this school meal program also promotes local purchases, as Mario has mentioned, and these must be connected to the Association of Small Farmers that improve the income as well as the sustainability both of the food of these small farmers as well as these school food programs.
We have excellent examples in Guatemala, where for many years, and with the help of FAO and UNDP, we were working on school nutrition together with the government. And there are others, Salvador, Nicaragua, and others where we work on policies on local and regional purchase. But it's very important working with new ways of buying, sustainability, and having a connection between the private sector and public procurement and the network of retailers. So we're working, taking a look at what's happening out there in the countryside. And let me, to finalize, thank all of you. We have many, many challenges ahead of us, as we've heard, but the region has many opportunities as well. We must join efforts and work together as we were doing together with ECLAC, FAO, governments, civil society, and others. There are so many, and even working with the indigenous populations and others who often are left aside from many of the activities. And we must also consider that we have to have more data and find solutions at short, mid, and long term to have resilient food systems that may prevent the shocks that are affecting the region and the whole world in order to reach zero hunger. Well, thank you all. And I do hope that I may answer your questions. Thank you, Ms. Castro, Director from the regional office. And we will now take a look at some of the concerns that we have received by the media. We will organize the Q&A session. First of all, we will ask the Executive Secretariat. This comes from French press, Miguel Sanchez and Pedro Suarez. Ask, why is there a paradox that Latin America, being a producer of foodstuff, how is it that the Ukraine conflict is putting its participation at such risk and having an increase in hunger of 30% between 19 and 21? How many persons are you talking about in the region that faced hunger? Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Indeed. Briefly, let me remind you, the paradox is due to the heterogeneity that we have emphasized. Quite clearly, yes, we are a region with a surplus, but we have some countries with large commercial agriculture and who are exporters of agricultural products. But these exports are not the same as the production that goes for the basic basket we all buy. We have family farming, we have small farms that supply for the domestic market. So this big diversity and difference between some net exporters, large countries that export, and the others that But most countries are net importers. Mexico, the Caribbean, they depend a great deal on the imports, and as well as many other countries, they import their food stuff. So that is the answer to that paradox. It's not such a paradox once we understand the structure. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Latin Press Agency asks FAO, the consultation, the economic and social conditions. Right now, are we going to achieve sustainable development, reaching zero hunger in Latin America and the region by 2030? Is that possible? Well, whoever can answer that is certainly many steps ahead. But I would make the question otherwise. Is it possible to reach that goal? Yes, it is still possible. Indeed, it's not a dream, a question, matter of dreams or designs. It means starting to build specific policies, specific measures. Undoubtedly, in these last times, three negative aspects were combined. First, food crisis as a result of the social injustice, but then came COVID. And if anything was missing, why, it was a war that would create this negative trio. But if we compare this with some years back, the situation is, I think, farther from what it used to be in terms of that goal. But we are still optimistic. We believe that there is still a world of possibilities. But that is so because the main players that must work in that direction, I'm talking about governments, civil society, should have, and the private sector that should have a more important role, and international institutions that will as well, in aiding and accompanying our governments. We are no magicians. We don't have the magic wand, but we do try to support public policy so that millions of persons may finally leave hunger behind. We are proposing a series of solutions. And we're not just saying, wow, how difficult things are, how far we are from that goal. No, I am not going through that way. The report that we have received that you will read is going to be very useful. But I do have some notes. And with these, I will summarize what, as of FAO, as of the crisis, of the war that started on February 24th, and the increase in 14% of CPI prices. I have a series of measures that we have brought to the governments, and we're talking to the governments with these, and these are also being adopted by governments. And this is all going in the right direction. That, together with the national budget policies in this direction, will come closer. I'm talking about not limiting the trade of fertilizers. I'm talking about more transparency of key data, alternative financial mechanisms, diversification of sources, and a variety of foodstuff and fertilizers, purchasing power through more income, the active role of food programs, the ties in social protection, encouraging agricultural production, strengthening social protection, organizing efficient use of fertilizers, technical assistance, and alternative fertilizers. In short, there's a whole menu of solutions that will help out in public policies, and that will move the needle to help out millions of persons. Maybe we won't come to the goals 2030, but if we come closer to them, and if we change the negative trend, we will be able to better face these negative situations. Thank you, Ms. Castro. The next question comes from Lingua Press. The report says that the region needs a coordination of policies through multilateral, multi-level, multi-stakeholder systems. The correspondent asks, how can the private sector have a more private role as well as NGOs to counteract the threats to food security in the region? Ms. Castro, you have the floor. Thank you. Well, I do believe that the private sector and NGOs are already taking up that role in the region. In the report, we hear that the private sector is a productive sector as well as one that has a lot to do with transport and storage of foodstuff. We know the transport of foodstuff right now is one of the reasons for the high costs of the products in the basic basket. And here we would try to improve the supply networks, making them more efficient. And that has to come hand in hand with the private sector. The private sector also has the capability to produce and to distribute. And the distribution to countries that have been mentioned here, the small developing island states that import most of what is consumed. And here in importing, they are facing these high prices. So we have to get together with the private sector for more efficiency. And we're working with sub-regional organizations such as ASS and CARICOM to improve the transport towards these islands and improve the availability of products in the islands. Now, as to NGOs, all governments and UN agencies are working together with NGOs in everything having to do with nutrition, especially in access and support to communities. This is already being done, but we can do a lot more, certainly. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Castro. We will now hear from the Interpress Service. The question is, how to increase interregional trade of foodstuff? How can that be done to face the food crisis because of the pandemic and because of the war between Russia and crisis that are facing now? We know that the moderate to serious hunger is affecting many, many persons as of 2019, and this is getting worse. How can this affect the millions and millions of Latin Americans? Interpress Service and the Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Indeed. Thank you for your question. Interregional trade of food is responsible for 38% of the imports of foodstuff for these countries. That is 62% of the food that's imported comes from other regions. But that varies. Mexico, for example, only 9% of their food import comes from other neighboring countries. But that 38%, almost 40% of interregional import-export is much greater than the average of interregional export of other products. So this is a lot more than what we have in the trade of goods and services. It's interesting to look at the structure of the interregional system. So that means we have a lot of potential to grow further, since many of the countries are stronger producers. We would have to have greater promotion of and facilitation of products for interregional trade. We have to take a look at the prices and supporting small producers. Here we have a tremendous potential. There's a big momentum that would help create jobs and that would increase income for small producers. It would also improve food insecurity. And this is very important, interregional trade. And besides, there are many countries. Imagine Central America and the Andean group, where we find similar production, similar consumption habits. I think that there are pattern consumptions that are similar, and there's a tremendous potential to go into. The other question was how the continuation of the situation will affect life quality. Well, unfortunately, 56 million persons that go hungry is certainly very negative. That's not good. It's a tragedy. It's a disgrace. It's something that will leave long-term scars. Imagine people who are in that situation, or even the other situation of moderate hunger that don't eat one day every week. But I think that this involves families and people who perhaps are not having a good outcome in their grades, in their schools. So it's a vicious circle of extreme poverty that is reproduced, and it will leave terrible scars amongst these persons. The importance of tackling this, and the message that we leave, and the common view that we have at UN and the agencies that are working here, the importance of seeing this not as a specific issue, but it's something that has to do with education, with poverty, with the quality of living and prosperity in much of our population.
And recently with social cohesion and the quality of social compacts in the region. Very well, thank you very much, Executive Secretary. Amanda Santillán from Diario Financiero in Chile has the following concern. She asks, if you could outline the main risks of food security in the region and Chile in particular, and says, FAO announced last Friday an index saying that the price of food were falling for the 7th consecutive day. And I would like to ask you, why have these prices come down, and will they continue to drop? And where can the region and Chile see a reflection of this drop in prices? Thank you. Well, let's be accurate in terms of prices. In our monthly report on prices, there was something that the media was asking for. I'm not an economist, and José here is. And so I would limit to my knowledge. A few days after the start of the war, we were asked for data, trends. And well, trends are trends. Trends need time, need oxygen to understand where we're headed. Our first report on these issues related to the war were made known in late March, and we rose of the rise of 12 and 13%. And one of the themes that was asked about was whether that rise would continue. And we're talking about the most important rise since the 1990s in terms of the prices, not just a small inflationary hike. No, something very, very major. And subsequent data have shown that that was the ceiling, and that from that ceiling, there's been no further rise. Neither have they come down much, 0.1, 0.2, but we're around there. And so the context must be seen as a whole, a major rise and no major reduction, simply a maintenance on account of a number of measures that have been adopted in this period. And so there's a series of indicators of no rise of key factors, and that is why it has remained there. We did an exercise, a very simple one, in terms of the actions carried out by some countries, and that is helping. In the case of Latin America, helping these figures. I'm not going to limit myself to Chile because we're talking about regional and global scenarios. So let's see the following. What have countries of Latin America and the Caribbean done concretely to absorb this negative trend? The countries of South America have given priority to tax reductions price stability, and reduction of CPIs. Not all countries in Latin America, but a significant number. And these same countries, or similar, or within South America, have made efforts in policy to pass on the loss, to offset the loss in income to these farmers and so on. Other countries have monitored prices and the supply of food, subsidies, and discount coupons for the purchase of food or the payment of utilities, and they have focused on the use of organic fertilizers, increased the use of inputs, and farming insurers. Caribbean countries have placed a greater emphasis on the promotion and consumption of local goods, delivery of food, school meal programs that mentioned by Lola, that highlighted specifically the soup kitchens, urban and peri-urban areas, and better structures for the contribution of food, and concentrated efforts in subsidies for fertilizers and others. So what are we saying with all this? That this scenario is not black and white, that there is an objective situation where, on one way or another, a number of countries are moving ahead, connecting and in part absorbing an impact that without otherwise would undoubtedly be far more negative, and unfortunately it is not. Thank you. And now we're going to express the concern sent in by the correspondent of the Italian agency ANSA. She asks, the sanctions implemented by a series of countries against the Russian Federation for having invaded Ukraine have increased the crisis of affecting poorest countries. Should sanctions be, or economic embargoes should exclude them from in the region on account of food needs? This is what is asked by the IANSA agency regarding the trade sanctions and the embargo. Yes, thank you for that question. A very conflictive question, but let me answer. All food and products for food production are not sanctioned worldwide. It is clear that right now there are food products being moved from the Black Sea, and large amounts have been bought thanks to donors for countries going through serious food crises, Yemen, Somalia, and others. And so in that sense, this is moving. And also we are seeing now, last week, we saw how also fertilizers that were in some European ports are also being moved. And so we would like to say that in principle, there should not be an issue, but initially, as Mario said, there was an issue. And that at the start, on account of the war crisis, the chains were not there, the supply chains were not moving appropriately. But once the agreements were made and the chains began to move, and so the food products and fertilizers are not sanctioned and can move around the world to avoid these disruptions and the rise in food insecurity. But price rises, the deficit of fertilizers is not going to be resolved in 1 or 2 months after the very high hike in prices. But they have come down, they've not continued to rise, and fertilizers have reached countries that they could have got to before sowing. And so this is an issue that we have to resolve in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, as has been mentioned earlier by my 2 colleagues. I leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lola Castro. And I thank those of you who have been with us at this launch and press conference. We also reiterate our gratitude to Mario Lubetkin and Lola Castro, and of course, José Manuel Salazar, Executive Secretary of ECLAC. All the materials linked to this launch are already on the websites of the 3 agencies that have contributed to the report. We see that a significant number of questions have come in during the press conference and which we have been unable to answer in the time assigned. But we will, of course, our communication teams will try to respond in writing to the questions that have been sent in during this time. Of course, the teams of the FAO, WFP, and ECLAC. And so we thank all of you, the representatives of the mass media, and who are the bridge of the messages that have been presented here and the largest audiences of the activities of our organizations. And of course, we will meet again later on. Executive Secretary, as the host, would you have a few last words that you would like to share and to close the conference? Well, thank you very much. And I thank you for your attention, your interest. And as was said, precisely, the press is a partner of ours of the UN system and a pillar for the public discussion and debate of the CPB well informed, and that will in turn aid better responses. So I thank you once again and we'll express our welcoming of action together with other UN agencies. Thank you very much.